District of Columbia is suing the Trump administration over what it says was an illegal deployment of the National Guard throughout the city. The lawsuit was filed by Attorney General Brian Schwab, who also announced earlier this week that he is seeking re-election. Now, writing on X, he says, quote, D.C. did not request or consent to the deployment of National Guard troops, yet there are 2,300 National Guardsmen on our streets in military gear, carrying weapons, and driving armored vehicles. The deployment to D.C. violates the Home Rule Act enacted by Congress 52 years ago.
The lawsuit says this move by Trump has done, quote, irreparable harm to the nation's capital. But Trump is arguing the opposite. On Truth Social, the president has been touting statistics from the White House of more than 1,700 arrests made and hundreds of illegal firearms seized in his Washington, D.C. crackdown. And he set his sights on doing the same thing in Chicago, saying, quote, Chicago is the worst and most dangerous city in the world by far. Pritzker needs help badly. He just doesn't know it yet. I will solve the crime problem fast, just like I did in D.C. On X, conservative advisor and lawyer Mike Davis slammed the Attorney General's lawsuit, writing in part, President Trump lawfully and appropriately deployed the military to our nation's capital after local Democrat politicians refused to do their jobs and allowed crime to get out of control. Schwab would rather appease his rich white liberal friends in Northwest D.C. than save black lives in Southeast D.C.
But the ACLU for the District of Columbia says, quote, we applaud D.C. Attorney General Brian Schwab for defending the district against this abuse of power. The president's actions are about consolidating power and creating fear in the nation's capital. It's been a little over 3 weeks since the National Guard first mobilized troops in the district. This lawsuit comes just days after a judge ruled that Trump's use of the National Guard in Los Angeles back in June was also illegal. I saw that ruling come down and I was like, how is this going to come about? Because I think two things can be true. Crime did go down even further since federal troops have been here. It makes sense why it would. But I think the problem that Democrats should not be arguing is that they don't want crime to come down or federal assistance. I think the way that they went about it as an administration was not the correct way. I think the Secure DC Act, which was put in place in 2024 and signed by Mayor Muriel Bowser, helped bring crime down to that 30-year low that was cited in statistics and people kept saying over the last few weeks. But I think with some federal conversations with the Trump administration, there could have been a coordinated, funded effort long-term through Congress that could have possibly put D.C. in the best position possible, as opposed to what I feel is like a strong arming and an overreach, which is why now you're seeing what came down in California and the Attorney General suing about the way that all this was handled. I don't think it has to be like that. I think Republicans largely believe that places and states, D.C. is not a state, but should govern themselves. So I think D.C. should also have the autonomy under the Home Rule Act to govern itself to the best of its ability. And I think they were doing a good job based on those numbers going down.
I completely disagree that they were doing a good job. Yes, the numbers came down, but they were nowhere near where they should have been. And if you look at the difference from the 2-week period, the first 2 weeks of Trump's takeover, compared to the same 2-week period in 2023 and then in 2024, the crime drop was significantly faster when Trump sent in the National Guard. We saw carjackings go down by 86%. By comparison, in that same 2-week period from 2023 to 2024, they went down about 20 to 30%. And that's really the same throughout all crime categories. And we also know that DC was accused of manipulating their crime statistics to make violent crime look lower than it actually was. I think the other important facet here that a lot of people don't talk about is that there's lower reporting of crime because people feel like when they have an attorney general who is responsible for prosecuting most of the youth cases, and then there's the D.C. attorney who's appointed by the president. The 4 years under Joe Biden was Matthew Graves, failing to prosecute 67% of cases. People think, okay, well, if I'm the victim of a smash and grab or a carjacking, why would I even bother calling the police if I just expect that this person's going to be back out on the street the next day? So over the past 5 to 6 years, we have actually seen a more drastic difference between the FBI crime database, which tracks crimes that are charged and prosecuted, versus the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a self-reported survey of people who say they've been victims of crimes. And this difference is especially stark in Washington, D.C. because of the lack of reporting that's been going on. I think it's also important to point out that Mayor Muriel Bowser praised President Trump's assistance with the National Guard in a press conference just last week, citing these same statistics in terms of crime going down and saying that she was actually grateful for his help. So I can't imagine she's too happy with the Attorney General right now.
Well, I think Muriel Bowser is speaking out of both sides of her mouth, not because I dislike her in any way, but because I saw her interview on The Breakfast Club where she said she was completely blindsided and against this. So I think depending on who she's talking to, whether it's a national audience, she's saying one thing, and then if she's with a different audience, she's saying another thing. So for me, it seems very much like play the game of chess, because otherwise, you know that Trump has this thing where if he has a vendetta against you, he will go to the end of time to get to the bottom of it or come out of the other side of that vendetta. So that's why I think she's doing that. But either way, like I said, if crime is down, that is a good thing. I just think that there are long-term solutions that could have been implemented in a more collaborative way with the federal government, like putting community policing in place, like putting in community programs so you can get some of that youth off the street that maybe doesn't have the proper guidance. Long-term solutions that work directly with local government to make sure that this is sustainable. Because we know after, like, federal authorities would scare anybody straight, right? So they would get people in order. But to what end? Like, so when they leave, do we just all go back? Do all the homeless people come back? Do they get pushed to Virginia and then Virginia says you get out and they come back to DC? So I just want to see how this is going to last and have longevity here once the federal government leaves. And that's the biggest issue, is like a Band-Aid never solves a real problem.
I definitely want a long-term solution as well. I think, unfortunately, the DC City Council has shown that they're really unwilling to do that. In fact, after the pandemic, what they did was implement so-called criminal justice reform measures that continuously made the problem worse, one of which was a law that allowed youth offenders, they call them, but it's actually anyone under the age of 25 who are prosecuted as adults, so people who are committing murders, rapes, really the worst crimes, can get out in 10 years of prison. So if you murder someone when you're 24 in DC, you can get out when you're 34 years old. I don't think anybody believes that that's a good idea. They followed that up with an even greater revision of the DC criminal code that was so horrendous that even Joe Biden decided to veto that, or fail to veto, rather, Congress's legislation saying that DC wasn't allowed to implement that.
Yeah, I think DC has a lot to discuss about how to handle this moving forward, but I think the federal overreach piece is the biggest issue for a lot of people that are criticizing it. So a new jobs report is showing a possible turbulent future labor market. We'll break that down and what it means after a short break. Don't go anywhere.